My name is Kaitlyn Fisher, and today I'm going to be presenting the role of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois people in shaping the forest of northeastern North America. To provide some background context, the word Haudenosaunee is an indigenous name used for the league formed by the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. These were tribal societies with a semi-sedentary settlement pattern. Their villages were composed of a closely spaced longhouse, which they typically occupied for a generation or less, which suggests a distribution pattern. And typically, village abandonment has been attributed to the depletion of local resources and the buildup of refuse and waste in the locality. And here is just a map of where the Haudenosaunee people occupied at the time, and this is just around, you can see here that's Lake Ontario, so it's in southeastern Ontario. My primary source of literature is a paper by Clark and Royal titled Transformation of a Northern Hardwood Forest by Aboriginal Iroquois Fire, Charcoal Evidence from Crawford Lake, Ontario, Canada. It's important to highlight why this debate is so important, and here's some controversial evidence. So one is that interpretations are often based on secondhand observations. Two, early settlers may have had different motives for reporting prescribed burning. Three, little ethnographic evidence exists that supports the concept of routine vegetation burns. And four, problems resulting from burning may have outweighed the benefits. So in the paper, they hypothesized that if the fire were used to burn forests near small lakes, then accumulation of charcoal, significantly greater than background regional levels, should be recorded in the sediment. Finding charcoal accumulations would provide direct evidence for increased importance of fire in the vicinity of Indigenous settlements, as well as demonstrate that the method could be applied with pollen analysis over a broader region to determine the geographic importance of Indigenous burning in pre-settlement forests. Now, just to describe the study area was conducted in Crawford Lake, Ontario. It is a meromitic lake, meaning that it's permanent stable stratification, where mixing does not occur under the normal conditions. This allows for the examination of the relationship between forest examination and fire evidence. In the sediment, the couplets consist of summer calcite layers that alternate with dark organic rich winter layers, and the laminations are annual as there are cultural pollen indicators within the sediment. So there are different possible proxy methods that could have been used to conduct this research, one of them being charcoal, and the challenge that comes with that is that there's little information that actually links charcoal production from fires to charcoal accumulation in lakes. It's expensive, and varved lake sediments are rare to find. Another option is dendrochronology, although fire scars on trees are largely unavailable for pre-European times. And lastly, pollen is an option, but the spatial and temporal reconstruction is poor, it's difficult to identify breakage, and problems calculating concentrations or accumulation rates occur quite frequently. So for this study, they did use pollen as a proxy. Pollen grains are recovered in cores of sediment found in the bottom of lakes. Sediment cores are collected by drilling and using a hollow tubing, which is then cut into sections, which you can see in the photo on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see the layers indicating each year. The grains are very small. They're typically between 10 and 200 micrometers, which means they require mounting them on a microscope slide for examination. So how we can extract the pollen from the sediment includes 3 steps. The first step is sieving the sediment. So this is when you place a small amount of sediment onto a sterile filter with a mesh size slightly larger than the target pollen grains. You add some water and stir the sediment with a small spatula. You then wash the sediment through the filter into a petri dish. The second step is isolating pollen grains. And so to do this, you dilute the sample so that the grains are adequately spaced in the petri dish, and you can scan it at a 100 times to 200 times magnification, depending on the size of the pollen. Once a target grain has been found, you can switch to a lower magnification, ensuring that the grain can still be seen in the field of view. You place the tip of a glass pipette into the field of view and slowly lower it down into the water beside the pollen grain. Capillary action will ensue to capture the pollen grain and remove it from the water. And the third step is dilution, and all this is placing that pollen grain into a PCR tube if you're going to use PCR analysis to find the correct species. The second proxy that they used for the study was charcoal. Charcoal is produced when a fire incompletely combusts organic matter. The rate at which charcoal accumulates in a lake depends on the characteristics of the fire, as well as the processes that transport and deliver charcoal to the lake, which can be seen in the figure provided on this slide. So you can see regional charcoal and extra local charcoal, as well as local charcoal, how that will fall out into the redeposition of the lake, as well as the primary charcoal that's directly from the slope wash of the fire. So primary charcoal refers to the material induced shortly after a fire event, and then secondary charcoal, as mentioned before, is introduced during non-fire years as a result of surface runoff and lake sediment mixing. The relationships between fire characteristics and the accumulation of primary charcoal processes are discussed separately, but it's important to remember that both sources comprise the sedimentary charcoal record. And fire constructions based on lake sediment records are derived from three primary data sources. The first is particulate charcoal that provides direct evidence for burning. The second is pollen evidence of fluctuations in vegetation that can be tied to disturbance. And thirdly, it's the lithologic evidence of watershed adjustments to fire, such as erosion or the formation of fire-altered minerals. So in order to use this method as a proxy, they completed in their study something called the thin section method. So they used the core extracted from the sediment of the lake. The varbed sediments are dehydrated with acetone, impregnated with epoxy, and then cured into a thin section. The measurements are based on size classes. A grid is then moved on traverses across each varve, and then the number and area of macroscopic charcoal is recorded. So here's just a piece of charcoal that's found in the sediment. It's a macroscopic charcoal left after washing sediment through a screen. And it's important to note that charcoal particles are visually recognizable as opaque, angular, and usually planar, black fragments. But there are other black particles in sediments as well, such as minerals, plant fragments, and insect cuticles, which may sometimes be confused with charcoal particles. So it's very important to identify which is which. So after using that charcoal extraction method from the sediment, these are results that they concurred that would support the notion that Iroquois people did dramatically change the developments of forests that we know today in Ontario. So what they found was that fossil charcoal of the pre-Iroquois Zone 1 show consistently low accumulation rates. So this is before the Iroquois people arrived, as you can see in the chart at the bottom of the screen, between 61 BC and 1360 AD. And you can see that it's a 0.88 millimeters squared per centimeter per year. And so that's a relatively low value. And then you can see as you switch to zone 2, there's higher values and that occur in zone 2, which is when the Iroquois people arrived. So you can see it jumped from 0.88 to 1.15, as well as you can see on the chart that's on the right-hand side of the screen on pan B in the cultural phases, you can see that there are several large peaks of charcoal accumulation occurring. And then as the Iroquois people leave and the populations decline, you can see that so does the charcoal accumulation. So it went from 1.15 to 0.79 millimeters squared per centimeter per year. And now to offer an interpretation of charcoal data and application to cultural activities. So what they did was they compared the thin sections of charcoal in annually lamentated sediments with fire scars on nearby Pinus resinosa trees. So fortunately, those were available for them to compare and contrast the results that they got from the charcoal. And what they found was that individual surface fires could be identified as departure from the background levels. The burns were patchy, with individual catchments supporting fire in years where nearby catchments did not, meaning that these fires did not occur naturally and they were very well regulated, as other catchments did not catch on fire, only the ones that they wanted to, which is indicative of prescribed burning. And lastly, landscapes support a spatially integrated charcoal accumulation that is related to the burning activity on a regional scale. So they also use pollen in their methods, and so these are the results that were captured from their pollen samples, and they're just recorded in this chart here. So you can see the year is on the x-axis and the percent pollen is on the y-axis, as well as the zones are labeled there. So just a reminder, zone 1 is pre-Iroquois people, zone 2 is when the Iroquois people lived there, and then zone 3 and 4, that's post-Iroquois people. So what you can see is northern hardwood taxa, including Fagus and Acer saccharum, dominate before the zone 2 increases in herbaceous taxa. And then in zone 2, there's a decline of the northern hardwood types, as mentioned above, and increased Pinus and Quercus. So you can also see that this relates to the charcoal data. So where there was a spike in charcoal, that's when the decline of the northern hardwood types started. So here's some evidence that Iroquois people reshaped the forest. So firstly, the average charcoal accumulation rates were higher during Iroquois times than during any other interval over the last 2,000 years. And secondly, peak charcoal values suggestive of local fires only occurred twice in the last 2,000 years, which was only during the Iroquois occupation phase. So there's strong evidence that the Iroquois people did shift the change in the forest. Other evidence is that the sediment pollen from Crawford Lake, Ontario, suggests Fagus and Acer saccharum forests before Iroquois occupation, with a shift to after occupation, as mentioned before. Abandoned Iroquois lands supported successional Pinus strobus. Pinus increases at Crawford Lake with increased charcoal that attends the Iroquois occupation. And lastly, Crawford Lake shows the charcoal decline with Iroquois collapse of the 17th century. So you know that this charcoal is not appearing when the Iroquois people are not there. Implications for biodiversity of eastern deciduous forests. And this is that fire is one of the several disturbances that may explain the diversity of these forests. Not necessarily saying that fire is the only disturbance, which is why there is still so much debate about whether or not the prescribed burning of the Iroquois people were responsible for the shift in forest type. Although the data does suggest that oak will dominate with infrequent fire, that has not happened. So the regeneration of Pinus strobus and Quercus species on moderately fertile soils require agricultural changes or a fire landscape. The expansion of oaks at Crawford with Indigenous occupation supports the idea that pre-settlement oaks were limited by availability of sites disturbed by the fire, which also suggests that given the introduction of fire in northern hardwood forest, oak or pine would rapidly develop. Just some take-home messages for the presentation as a whole. So fire reconstructions developed from high-resolution lake sediment data that span centuries to millennia offer unique insights about fire that cannot otherwise be obtained. These records disclose the historical range of variability in fire activity over the duration of a vegetation type, including the role of large-scale changes of climate, the consequences of major reorganization, as well as the influence of prehistoric human activity in different ecological settings. And lastly, charcoal and pollen proxies can be useful tools in paleoecology and information about fire regimes and their influence on our current ecosystem. Here are the resources that were used throughout this presentation. Thank you for your attention.